Yeah, but if you scan that off right now, it's showing.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So we're on time. I know everyone's time is precious, but I appreciate you so much joining us for April Clear Up the Chaos. I have Mitch with Ironwood, who y'all are accustomed to seeing here with us this morning. I also have Christine and Kevin joining us with Ironwood as well. But some of the hot topics that we are going to be discussing this morning include the potential gaps with your background checks that you may be currently running, how pay transparency laws may impact your business, and risk and rewards when rehiring former employees. So if you would kindly go ahead and mute so we can all hear, and I'm going to pass things off to Mitch for him to begin. Thanks so much.
Good. So before we jump into it, one thing that we did kind of discuss doing, which is why we've got Kevin and Christine on here, is at the end, we wanted to put together a Q&A to give everybody a chance to kind of ask those questions that come up. They may be related to the presentation, they may not be, but I brought in two experts today. So if you have any questions that come to mind, feel free to pop those in the chat and we'll run through those at the end. But we'll go ahead and get started with pay transparency. With multiple states, they've been implementing pay transparency laws to ideally help improve pay equity. So we wanted to dive in and help explain what this means and help cover the potential benefits and drawbacks. Depending on the states and cities that are passing those ordinances, those laws may require that job postings include a salary range or even the full benefits package, or they'll prohibit asking about an employee's previous salary, or even in some cases, in certain states, they'll actually require the employer to provide the employee with the salary range for their position when they ask. So for those states that do have those pay transparency laws, even though Texas doesn't, it's still worth kind of talking about the potential impacts of those laws. So the intent of those laws is to help promote pay equity by essentially oversharing. If everyone can understand how their pay is determined for a given role, it'll help reduce the likelihood that historically underpaid groups such as minorities will be lowballed on an offer. But while it seems like a newer trend, it really isn't. I mean, I know early on in my career, I didn't know that it was actually permitted for employees to discuss their wages. I remember my first job, they actually had a policy in place that prohibited that, which if you're not familiar with it, the NLRB actually does consider that protected activity. So even though it's still pretty common to see those policies prohibiting the discussion of wages, be mindful that that can potentially interfere with protected employee activities. So you'll want to be very careful with the wording on that. I'm not going to dive super deep into that at the moment, but it is just something to keep in mind if you do have those policies in place. You might want to take a look at that. But additionally, there are many websites out there. I mean, Glassdoor does it, Indeed, Onet. There's tons of websites that provide a platform where you can compare the market value for a given position. Some will even aggregate salaries for certain companies. So you can look up big companies like Amazon, punch it in on Glassdoor, punch in the position, and it'll actually give you what employees have reported for their salary for that given position. So as such, even though Texas isn't one of those states that has pay transparency laws, the impacts are still felt through programs such as these. I mean, short term, it does help eliminate some of the confusion for applicants when they're applying for a position, and it does potentially improve the onboarding process while helping to ensure that two candidates will receive comparable pay for the same work. I'm sure at least one other person on this call has been in that situation where a salary isn't posted, you applied for that position, you go through all the interview loops, and then find out at the end that the salary isn't anywhere close to where you need it to be. So by having that salary range built into your job postings up front, you can minimize those situations. And ideally, when you're ready to make the offer, the employee will, or the potential candidate will have enough information to going into it, understand, hey, this is the range we're working with, and it'll help smooth out that negotiation process and help reduce frustration for both the company and the employee. That said, the impact of pay transparency isn't limited to just candidates. I mean, wage compression can become more visible. So wage compression, if you're not familiar with it, it's when that gap between your highly experienced, high-performing employees starts creeping up within or becoming very close to that of a new employee. I mean, I was seeing it at a previous company where during the big tech hiring boom back in 2021, we had to increase our salaries to start attracting those candidates. Well, the issue with that was we started bumping up our starting salary, but we weren't necessarily looking at the previous employees or the current employees. So what that meant was we were hiring in somebody with no experience, minimal relevant knowledge, and paying them more than somebody who'd been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So what happened with that was these employees that had been with us a while started going, well, why am I getting paid less? So they start looking for other jobs. They'd reach out to us. We'd have to do a dive and save. So we'd do a comp analysis as a one-off to try and address the issue. But that morale hit still happened. I mean, their performance started dropping. The attrition ended up increasing. So it's just something to keep in mind that with that transparency, you want to make sure that your processes are clear and fair across the board. Again, some other drawbacks. If your pay system is fair and shows a correlation between performance and pay, it's more likely that your employees will be motivated to improve their performance. I mean, my background was in psychology. If you look at it, you know, reward systems, Skinner boxes, things like that. If you give a reward for something you want, that performance is reinforced and it's more likely to happen in the future. Conversely, if your pay system isn't fair, and it's based on things like favoritism, things that don't really relate to performance, employees are going to look at that and go, well, why should I work harder? Why should I go above and beyond? It's not going to matter. So it's going to have that opposite effect where it's going to impact their morale, their performance is going to drop. So it's just something to keep in mind if you do start shifting to a more transparent process. With the visibility of wages, they've also found that while lower paid workers have been increased, higher paid employees have also been limited in their earning potential as salary ranges became tighter. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere. So if you're increasing on the lower end, it's going to impact that budget to try and go up there and hire that top dollar talent. So how can you use this to your benefit? Well, if you have the time, it's worth periodically going through and just auditing your pay structure. Making sure your salary ranges make sense for a given position. Make sure that they're competitive. Websites like those I mentioned before can be helpful in ensuring your salary ranges are comparable to your competitors. You can also just look at their job postings, particularly if you're in a state that requires it. From there, you can start analyzing your employees' current positions within that salary range. So things like your compa ratio, which compares the employee's salary to the midpoint of the salary range, or range penetration. So you've got your salary range and it shows you how far into that salary range that employee is. That can be helpful in assessing and identifying employees who may need adjustment. From there, look at their performance, tenure, knowledge, experience to see if these areas would support an increase. The process can also be helpful if an employee reaches out regarding an increase. I mean, if they're feeling like they're underpaid or if they're looking for a counteroffer, being able to look at the metrics that go into it and kind of figure out, okay, well, you're saying you're underpaid, but you're actually right around the midpoint and that's in line with your performance. It'd give you a metric that you can lean on and data that you can lean on to push back or take into consideration, as opposed to just going, okay, you feel underpaid, here's an increase. The other big thing is you're going to want to have a plan on how to handle those wage discussions with your employees. Having that plan in place will go a long way towards minimizing frustration. So big issue that I was seeing a lot with remote workers is they'll look at their salary across the board. Well, at one of my previous companies, we actually had different geographic tiers. So places like Seattle, San Francisco, Austin, where the cost of living's astronomical, the employees tended to be paid higher than somewhere like McAllen or Midland, where the cost of living is a lot cheaper. So when an employee would reach out and saying, hey, I'm underpaid, but I live down in Texas, being able to clearly articulate, well, we base it off geography. This is the market value down here. These are why we make these determinations. Went a long way towards trying to reassure the employee that we're taking care of them as best we can and really building that trust among the employees. So while there's research that's still in progress on the long-term impacts, I mean, the pay transparency laws were passed fairly recently, but initial research has shown that there can be benefits, particularly if your system's fair. Like I said, positive reinforcement's always huge. If people can see a correlation between their performance and their pay, they're more likely to perform at a high level. Conversely, if that's not the case, if it's not fair, there can be potential negative impacts. One thing that I found kind of interesting when I was preparing for this was there was actually a study on the National Hockey League where they went through and they made players' salaries transparent. Well, the transparency, when it happened, it revealed that there was a focus on goal scoring and assists that were valued more. So your superstar shooters, your playmakers that were making those passes tend to be paid more than those that were your rock star defensive players. So as a result, because that was the metric that led to higher pay, there was a shift towards players becoming more offensively focused and defense became less of a priority. So if you do have performance-based pay, be mindful of what metrics you're using just to make sure that you're not overly emphasizing one area and neglecting another key area that you'd still want performance in. So let's pivot a bit though. Let's talk about rehires. Benefits of rehiring a candidate that's worked for you before can be great. You've got a candidate with unique experience that few, if any, candidates will have, an understanding of your processes, your policies, your procedures. So the ramp up time ideally should be faster. I mean, they've already got that base knowledge, so you can start working on getting them up to speed sooner. While it will still take a little bit of time for them to adjust to any changes that have happened since they previously worked there, they'll still require less training than somebody that's coming in from the outside with no experience. And ideally, it'll be saving you some time and money on training costs. In their time away, they might have picked up some extra skills or a new way of thinking that will benefit the company even more, especially in situations where the employees left for an opportunity that's not available in their previous role. They'll very likely have picked up a new skill or two that they can bring over to your company and help drive things forward with. There's also the potential morale boost for your current employees. I mean, if you hired somebody that everybody loved working with and you brought them back, the rest of the team's going to say, hey, we like that guy. We're going to be happier because he's around. It's good working with him again. It'll also potentially have the effect of employees seeing that somebody left and came back. They'll look at it as, oh, well, things must be good here because that person came back. They went out. The other place must not have been as good because this person wants to come back. However, while that's just a short list of the pros, there are some potential issues that could pop up. I mean, if their previous departure was on poor terms or the rehire had some issues with previous employees that still work with the company, that rehire could hold a grudge or carry resentment towards the company or those employees. I mean, if there was tension before and nothing's changed and you bring that person back, there's probably still going to be tension. Depending on why they left, there's also the possibility that they would leave again. Depending on the industry, it may be more or less common. I know in security and some other high turnover industries, it's not uncommon for employees to bounce between different companies chasing a paycheck. I mean, when I was in security, we had quite a few employees that they'd average about 6 or 8 months with us, and then they'd bounce to one of our competitors, and then another competitor, and then back to us, and then just cycling through them about every 6 and 8 months. Even though we bring them back, it was inevitable that these employees would end up leaving before that year was up. So with that in mind, when you're considering whether or not to rehire somebody, it's worth looking at a couple different things. I'd start with their previous time with the company. I mean, how were they as an employee? With most candidates, you have to try to piece together their performance based on their resume, reference checks you do, during their interview, you're trying to look at the information that they're presenting to you to say, okay, well, is this person going to succeed with us? With rehires, you already have some data that you can look at. I mean, if you take a look at their past performance reviews or disciplinary history, you can get an idea if that candidate was a high performer that made a positive impact while they were with the company, or if they were a low performer that may have caused some issues. I mean, it may seem like we stress documentation at every Clear Up the Chaos, but at the end of the day, having strong documentation is great for situations like this. We had a rehire that had been terminated for theft at a previous company. Well, the documentation wasn't processed correctly. It got keyed in as a resignation, if I recall correctly. It was done in another state, so we didn't have a full back history on it. Well, we brought that employee back, and a couple months later, same thing happened. The employee was caught stealing from the company. During our investigation, we found out that they'd been terminated for the same thing. So the second time around, we made sure that the termination was processed correctly. But things like that can be a red flag that if you're looking at rehiring somebody, looking at the reason for leaving, can give you a lot of information. I mean, things like if they worked a full notice period, if they were terminated for cause, if they resigned during an investigation, could all be potential indicators of whether or not you should move forward. But that said, their past history shouldn't be the only factor. I mean, even if you had somebody who struggled when they were with you before, they may not have been the right role. They may not have been as ready to work for the company. People mature, people change over time. So if somebody struggled a bit when they were early in their career, they may have progressed and become a rock star since then. And that's where you'll want to, even if you have that baseline from their prior employment, you still want to take a look at what's changed since then. That's where doing your interview is huge. When you're interviewing them, try to determine what new skills they can bring. It's always a good idea to ask them why they left before. Even if they resigned to look for another opportunity, they may reveal that, hey, there was an issue with a previous manager that's since left. They may have left due to tensions with a coworker, things like that. So if you try to drill into it and figure out why they left during that interview, that can be helpful. On the flip side, if they left for more money, that could be an indicator of, okay, well, they're just chasing a dollar. Yeah. However, if they were leaving to find another opportunity that was going to give them more advancement opportunities, they could have left to gather those skills and then come back to use those skills. So that's kind of why you still want to do that full interview loop, because you can figure out things like that, figure out what's going to be different this time around. You can also give the employee to address any red flags that were there. Like I mentioned before, I mean, if there was a disciplinary history, hey, you had a lot of issues with tardiness. What's going to be different this time around? Maybe they've taken some time to better themselves and work on finding a way to address what caused the attendance issues. So even if you have somebody who was with your company that was just super rock star, your number one employee, they left, they went to go get advancement, now they're trying to come back, it's still worth taking a look at the rest of the candidate pool. And the reason for that is, even if you had somebody who was a superstar before in their previous role, your needs may have shifted, the culture may have shifted. So it's still worth taking a look at everyone to make sure that you're hiring the best candidate for what you need. Somebody who was able to thrive in the old culture may not be a fit for the culture that you're trying to build now. Whereas if you have somebody else who maybe they don't have that prior experience with your company, but their better culture fit could be more of an asset. I've been on those interview panels where we had somebody who they had that prior experience with us. They were fairly likable, but our needs had shifted. We needed somebody that wasn't going to continue the status quo. We needed somebody who was willing to take the initiative and innovate. And we felt like we had another candidate that they didn't have the internal knowledge, but they had that outside perspective that we were looking for. And we ended up going with that candidate over the rehire. But at the end of the day, Whether or not you rehire a candidate should be looked at like any other candidate. Does this person bring what I need to the table? I mean, while you have some additional information that will aid you in making that determination, it's still very important to remember that familiarity with the company can have both benefits and drawbacks, and that all of that should be considered before moving forward. So staying on the topic of onboarding, we're going to pivot a little bit to background checks. Depending on the company and the industry, it's becoming more and more common. But even though it'll give you potential information on red flags for employment, there's quite a few common pitfalls to avoid. But in order to touch on them, it's worth covering how background checks work. I mean, if you're going through a company like Accurate, I mean, there's dozens out there. But the way it works is typically you're paying for access to a database of public records. While there are some companies that will go out and actually directly visit courthouses to get copies of all the records, conduct reference checks, employment checks, education verification, things like that. For most of kind of your generic companies, they depend on the information that's been put into that database, which, depending on how the company processes that request, the information may be incomplete or inaccurate. I used to run into this all the time at a previous company where our original provider would only search the county we specified. So if we got the last 7 years of address history, we punched it all in, and we missed a county, or the employee was arrested outside of their county of residence, nothing would show up. I mean, we'd end up missing it. Another background check company that we used, it wouldn't search municipal courts. So there were some charges that were missed that were at a lower level. So taking a look at how your company runs your background check can help identify potential gaps that might be getting missed. I mean, you never want to be in a situation where for licensing requirements, you have to run a background. You send it off, everything comes back clear. So you complete the licensing application, pay the fees associated with it, and then come to find out the Department of Licensing is going to send you an intent to deny because something was missed. Another company would pull anything associated with the social security number and date of birth, meaning we'd get information on individuals that weren't our candidates. It'd have a date of birth match, but the name would be different. Or the social would match, but it's because they had somebody co-sign on a loan. So just because you're getting that information on that form, it doesn't mean that, okay, it's on there, therefore we need to take it as fact. It's still worth taking a look at it, reading through it, and making sure that you understand what information is actually being provided. From there, you can start looking at the dispositions in the charge itself to determine whether or not a given charge is relevant. At the end of the day, an arrest doesn't mean the candidate was guilty of anything. Charges can be dismissed, pled down, sentencing can be deferred pending completion of other requirements, things can be expunged, things like that. So shifting the focus away from that initial arrest to what was confirmed via the final disposition will help avoid issues where a candidate's punished for something they were never convicted of. And we'll kind of look at that a little bit later on as well. But ideally, you want to look at the time and nature of the crime, as well as the nature of the role itself that they're applying for. So a 5-year-old misdemeanor may not have an impact on the potential employee's role, whereas somebody who was recently released for felony fraud or embezzlement may not be a good fit for your open accountant role. I mean, similarly, convictions for something involving driving or vehicular crimes like DUI will probably have more of an impact on, say, a delivery driver who would need to drive every day versus a receptionist who will be sitting at a desk. Having a framework for adjudicating backgrounds and identifying what will be potentially disqualifiers is an essential part of that process. But even if you have that framework or a matrix in place, that doesn't mean that you need to take it as kind of a hard line, okay, you have X, we're not moving forward. I mean, you may need to look at licensing guidelines, the nature of the role, the level of trust, and any relevant laws into consideration when making those initial determinations. like I said, a blanket policy may not cover everything. More and more states are actually passing laws to that potentially impact what crimes you can actually look at and factor into making that determination. So there's another common pitfall that I've seen where companies aren't following the Fair Credit Reporting Act. This is where, because so the Fair Credit Reporting Act is in place to help regulate the information that's being put out, as well as how to address situations where information is disputed. So that's where that pre-adverse process comes into play. So before you make that final determination, it is required that the employee would have the opportunity to dispute any inaccurate information. Generally speaking, there's 4 steps to the process. So once you've kind of reviewed the initial background check, you make your initial determination. If it's, hey, we don't want to move forward because of something in your background check, you do need to notify that employee in writing. From there, you afford the employee a reasonable time to dispute any inaccuracies. You don't need to state specifically what was in their background check, but just that, hey, something in your background came up. Unfortunately, we are intending to not move forward. Here's our process for it. The employee has that time to reach out, try to get any information corrected, or provide an explanation for it. Depending on the information the employee provides, you should review it. It's not something where, okay, we're checking the boxes, we're doing the pre-adverse process, and that's it. You should take a look at it, because sometimes, hey, a charge was entered in this way, but the employee was actually able to complete a diversion program and they were never actually convicted. Once you've taken a look at everything that's been provided, if the background check company provides you with a corrected report, you should use that one. But once you've got all that information together, then you can make your final determination. So a final point to cover are pending charges, which, I mean, we average at least 1 call a month on something touching on it. Typically, that's more when an employee is arrested. But generally speaking, like I covered before, just because somebody's arrested, it doesn't mean that they're guilty of a crime. If it's a current employee, generally speaking, it's always a good idea to wait for the charges to receive that final disposition before you can make a determination. I mean, I had one at a previous company where an employee was arrested on, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 felonies, but it was a pretty big deal. However, the charges ended up getting dismissed after about a week because they had arrested the wrong person. So, I mean, had we just looked at that and gone, okay, you were arrested for 3 felonies, we're terminating your employment, that could have had some potential risk for us because we had terminated somebody wrongfully. However, because we waited, we were able to figure out, okay, nothing happened. This is kind of the circumstances on it. We got confirmation that the charges were dismissed and we were able to continue employment. So if you do have a current employee who gets arrested, it's a good idea to have a policy in place regarding employee arrest. Typically, we'd recommend having a window where the employee needs to notify the company of the arrest. And what I've always recommended is just place the employee on an unpaid leave of absence. That'll buy you some time for them to sort out their legal issues until the charges are resolved. So while background checks are a great tool, as with anything, it shouldn't be the single determining factor. And it's worth taking the time to review those issues before making the determination. I mean, as far as background checks, like I said, they're great for showing a snapshot, but it doesn't always show everything. Typical background checks are 7 years. For certain positions, you can go beyond that. Typically, it's based on income and kind of their position within the company for higher tier roles. But because you're only looking at that short window in most cases, you may not catch charges that are outside of it. So it's another factor to take into consideration. Things like credit checks may be applicable for certain positions, but aren't relevant for everything. If you're conducting reference checks, keep in mind that odds are if somebody's putting somebody down as a reference, they're probably handpicking. So it's probably going to be somebody giving a positive reference. When you reach out to prior employers, odds are they're probably not going to be giving you a whole lot of information just because there's potential risk associated with saying, hey, this employee wasn't very good. So be mindful of that as well. But you can look for things like discrepancies. If an employee is saying that they worked for a company from, say, 2010 to 2020, and it turns out they only worked for that company for 5 years, well, you might need to circle back with the employee to figure out what was actually going on in that 5-year gap. I mean, you'll see it on resumes where if it's a couple month gap, they'll say that they were continuously employed just because they don't want to speak to that layoff period. Things like that can pop up from time to time. So it's always worth, depending on how in depth you're going and the nature of the role, if something does pop up, circle with the employee, figure out what's going on, and they can help kind of bring clarity to it. Same with education checks. I actually had an old roommate of mine where he had graduated with his bachelor's, or so he thought, but he had missed one final piece of paper to finalize it. So he thought he graduated. He thought that he had his diploma or his bachelor's degree, but when they ran the education check, he couldn't produce it. And the school was reporting that, hey, you hadn't actually graduated because this box wasn't checked. So what ended up happening in that situation was he was able to gather the information, show that he had satisfied all the necessary credits. He had letters from the school stating, hey, you've satisfied everything you need to graduate. You're just missing form 1, 2, 3, 4. He was able to turn that into his employer, show when he would be able to receive his diploma, and move everything forward that way. So even though there was the initial report saying, hey, he doesn't actually have his degree, he was able to get the information to contest it and show, oh, I actually do, just there was an issue with the processing. So, I mean, that's just kind of a quick overview of pay transparency, rehires, and background checks. I mean, I could have spent an hour on each topic, but what I wanted to do was make sure that we had time to give everybody a chance to ask any questions. Like I said, I mean, the goal with this ideally was, you know, questions come up all the time, give you guys a platform to kind of bounce ideas off each other and see what comes up. So are there any questions so far? Or?
So yes, I have one to present, and feel free if you don't want to speak, you can submit those via the chat box and I'm happy to relay those over to Mitch. But Mitch, you were speaking to situations kind of going to the rehiring of employees that have been there before. So if an employee continues to, you know, kind of jump from job to job, you know, every 6 months, wanting more pay, and then is coming back, can an organization put in their contract, you know, you need to say this amount of time, at least this amount of time, or is that something that can be done?
So in at-will states, it can be a little bit tough because employees do have the right to leave employment at any time. However, what you can do is if you're issuing a bonus or something like that, you can build in potential clawback clauses. So, hey, this bonus is contingent upon you working for at least a year. If you leave prior to that year, you would have to repay the bonus or portion of it, depending on how it's all structured.
Okay. And then another question that has come is, and I don't think y'all do, but does Ironwood offer assistance with background checks, or can you share, and I can send this in a follow-up, but who y'all do recommend for background checks?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So because of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, I know the insurance industry has really kind of been shut down on sharing MVRs with clients. So, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, anyone who shares a background check or an MVR becomes a credit reporting agency in themselves. So we aren't a background check company, but we've been referring the same family-owned business for almost 20 years. And they have a fantastic online system for tracking all your MVRs and background checks that you use. And they even go through the pre and post adversary letter process based on the person's salary. So they've got a very good, strong hand-holding process of navigating if you stumble across something that's not good. It's called the Cole Group. I'm happy to send you you've probably seen that referral in the past. They're fantastic.
I believe I have that information, but I will send that over to all the participants so that they're aware of that, should they be looking for someone to contest that.
Yeah, Christine just dropped Charlie. He's the VP, just dropped the contact information in the chat.
Look at you. You're the best.
They don't mess around.
I know. Y'all are always on it. Okay, feel free.
And there was a question you had first. I wanted to kind of follow up with what I've seen in my experience on your first question about, trying to assure that person that hops stays a certain amount of time. And, that as from the employer, from the business owner's perspective, giving up that right that you're afforded and that to terminate at will and implementing a contract in place is almost never advisable unless you're dealing with a very unique industry. I'm never in favor of an employer willingly giving up that right. Employment contracts were a big thing back in the day. In order to have a non-compete hold, you had to have an employment contract in place. And then that employment contract and non-compete kind of separated as things evolved. Obviously, they're evolving again. I think y'all had previous clear up the chaoses on those. So I'm never in favor of a business voluntarily giving up that right to terminate at will.
Okay. So I'm going to open this up. Feel free to submit via chat, or if you'd like to unmute and ask your question yourself, feel free. This is a great opportunity. We have 3 awesome individuals here to answer any questions that y'all have. So if anything comes to mind.
I can tell you examples of things going wrong. We've had calls where people have been accused of major crimes, just as Mitch brought up, out of retaliation, not out of fact, just on I can make my manager go away by making a false claim. The one thing I just had a call last week on this. The one thing I tried to assure the owners is don't assume it's true. It's scary, but don't assume it's true. What if it's false? So doing an accurate investigation goes a long way.
Okay. Didn't think about that.
It happened quite a few times, actually.
These topics were great because, kudos to Mitch and Elizabeth for picking them, because we get so many calls on these 3 topics. And, with the labor market still trying to work itself out post-COVID, we see a lot of employers really struggling in this rehire arena where they wouldn't have considered someone eligible for rehire pre-COVID. Now, with the struggle of finding candidates, they're trying to look a little bit more in that gray area. And we're taking so many calls about, well, this person, did these poor performance things, but we really need this position filled. And they're willing to kind of compromise. And in all cases, proceed with caution. Would be the greatest advice, because we tend to see that if there was fact-based evidence of performance issues in the past, those things are not likely to change. And And we encourage you guys calling as you're navigating these rehire decisions because it's sticky. It's, you know, you could run into things of safety issues. You become more, I guess, you're taking on some risk in some rehire situations that you may not have otherwise been willing to take on. So
I have a great story on that one. We had
Sure.
a client, big machine shop, made steel beams, all kinds of really heavy exotic stuff. They only hired out of the drug rehab facility locally in town because they just believed that, you know, given second chances, and they felt that there was going to be a more loyal employee base. So they had an employee they hired. He fell off the wagon. They terminated him. They decided to rehire him. Well, during the interview, he tells the vice president that, you know, when the vice president says, hey, you're going to have to go in for your drug test, he says, you know, I've got a really good stash at home of pot. Can I burn that this weekend and you drug test me in 2 weeks? And the vice president said yes. Day 2 on the job, he stepped between and had a beam crush him at a life flight, and he survived. But because they knowingly put him in harm's way, impaired, they were looking at $300,000 or $400,000 settlement because this guy had no coverage because Texas Mutual denied coverage for a positive THC test. We fortunately got Texas Mutual to reopen the case and with some attorneys, but you know, you've got to be careful of the decisions you make. They're not casual. To Christine's point, a background check or an issue in their past can become a safety issue quickly. And when you knowingly put an employee in harm's way to themselves or others, you're in violation of OSHA.
All things to consider. How at risk do you want to be? Oh,
I had a
how
small business.
desperate are you to fill that spot, that position?
A small business owner hired a bookkeeper, unsupervised bookkeeper, accountant, that had a known conviction and jail time for embezzling. Hired him to be the bookkeeper for the company, and guess what happened?
The same thing, yeah. Mm. Wow. Wow. Well, I appreciate y'all's time. Nothing else has come in. I do want to remind everyone on the call, as a client at NCW in Sanford and Tatum, you do have complimentary access to Ironwood and this wonderful group of individuals, and their team is much more vast than just them. So I do encourage you, if you haven't taken the time to complete that paperwork prior to a crisis or a need. Things go much smoother when that is in place. And I will send that paperwork out when I send the recording and the information on the Cole group as well. But I do appreciate all of your time, and I look forward to having you join us in May. Thank you, Christine. Everyone have a wonderful day, and please be on the lookout for their recording. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. Bye.